The one thing that Russ Campbell used to mention when he talked about this program, and he was very proud of it and he loved to talk about it, the one thing that I always remembered is he said that at the very beginning they thought that the children by 6th grade would sound just like native speakers from Mexico or Spain or any other country. That was what the hypothesis was at the very beginning, that these children would sound just like native speakers. And of course, what was found out is they don't sound exactly like native speakers. They're very fluent in the language. They have a lot of wonderful language skills, but they make errors of non-native speakers. And so that's one area that Tara's going to talk about that has changed in the way we look at immersion and how we address some of the immersion issues. Okay. So one of the reasons that immersion has been so successful through the years has been the parental support. And the Organization of Advocates for Language Learning that has sponsored this event was a really integral part in getting immersion programs started around the country. So as you know, ALL is a national parent advocacy group for immersion education. It was started in Culver City, California. And it really has had a significant unifying effect on all immersion across the country. They've sponsored a wide range of activities. They've had national conferences over the years. And they've also had a really innovative 5th and 6th grade student exchange program that has been duplicated in other districts as well. And Madeline Ehrlich, the founder of ALL, has been instrumental in developing a real camaraderie among immersion programs in disparate areas across the country. And at one point there were 10 chapters with hundreds of members around the country, and that has been a really positive influence. One of the topics that was often discussed at these meetings is how often and when should parents ask their kids to translate for them? And this is an example of when a father thought it might be important to ask the child to translate for them. Moving on to the growth of immersion. This chart shows the growth starting in 1971 with Culver City to 2011. And you can really see the gradual increase. We now have over 400 programs. And this data comes from the Center for Applied Linguistics. We have an online directory of immersion programs, and we're just now in the process of updating it, so this is still draft information, and it's going to be changing a little. But what's really exciting is, in the last decade, overall, language teaching at the elementary school level has decreased. We do a survey every 10 years, and our results show a real decrease in language teaching overall at the elementary school level. But what's so exciting is that immersion has not decreased, it has increased. And we're seeing a lot of other parts of immersion that are really showing us that immersion is leading the way in language education at the elementary level. Okay. And now Tara's going to talk about best practices.
Hi. It's just great to be here. First I'll say I'm Tara because I think many of you maybe know Nancy. I'm sort of the newcomer here in Culver City. I had the privilege of coming out and working with the Culver City teachers just a couple of years ago. But I work at CARLA, Center for Advanced Research on Language Acquisition. And my title is Immersion Projects Coordinator, which means I have the privilege of working in professional development and working in program growth with immersion programs across the United States. I've been in that position, started graduate school. Actually, I was kind of a handoff for the last fall conference. I was there presenting data from a survey in, I think it was in Detroit. Yep, we talked about that. I was in Detroit, and And we've been working on growing immersion programs along with others in the country ever since. I was asked to talk a little bit about immersion education from the standpoint of what we know about immersion from research and how best practice guidelines have evolved and changed over the years. We could have a debate about which ones I might have been able to choose, and I'm just picking and choosing some of those that really strike me as having been important shifts. First, we're going to go back to those early years, and someone's already mentioned, in the early years, the guidelines were this is intended for students with limited to no second language. So we got a much more homogeneous group of students in those early days, and that was seen as actually critical to the program design. Another piece in the early days that was seen as absolutely fundamental, and it was sort of the mark of language immersion education, was Krashen's comprehensible input. Comprehensible input is all you really need, or it's the most important ingredient in becoming proficient in a second language. So a tremendous amount of energy went to making sure that the input was comprehensible. And I would say, and I work with language immersion teachers around the country, that that is actually the skill that comes most naturally. It's more like that caretaker kind of language. It's the motherese, those sorts of adaptations that I think we do very naturally. Merle Swain came along in the mid-'80s, contesting that focus on comprehensible input, and really proposed that what they were really seeing and learning in language immersion classrooms was that comprehensible input, while necessary, was not sufficient. And that's when she began to develop the comprehensible output theories that she proposed, and then for the rest of her career actually continued to expand on. Another essential best practice guidelines in the early days of immersion was separation of languages. And the separation of language was to be clear, very clear. There was not to be any kind of concurrent translation happening that was at the time seen as acceptable and good practice in many bilingual classrooms. So immersion distinguished itself from really adhering to clear separation of languages. Another best practice, negotiation of meaning. Negotiating meaning was primary and was what was mostly written about and talked about in the literature, which takes us back to the teacher's mastery of providing context clues. And I just named a very few. Anne Snow actually wrote about those in an early study with the immersion teachers. Most recently published, I think, in 1990. The last best practice guideline that I thought I would talk about is indirect modeling. Linked sort of to Krashen's hypotheses, this had to do with that filter, making sure that you had that filter, the affective filter, low enough, and so you didn't want to really mess with that affective filter. And so when the children would make some sort of an error when it came to language production, best practice was recasting. You would model back the correct way of languaging around that. What was the research agenda like in those early days? We spent, and actually still today, spend a tremendous amount of time and energy looking at program outcomes, because it seems no matter where immersion is born, everybody is certain that it may not work there. So we go back and we keep looking at achievement in L1, reading and math, and we have paid less attention to in the United States. The Canadians have done a much better job with this than those of us in the States, but we have looked, and we still do try to look at proficiency development and achievement in the second language. The Canadians did a great deal of comparison with their core French. We have very limited studies, there are some on immersion students relative to FLUS students, foreign language in the elementary schools. And Canadians have also taken a look at how immersion students' language development fares in contrast to native speakers of the second